we have a long tradition. We have a long tradition of meeting in person. And so it's been nice to be able to be flexible over the last year. And we also look forward to the time when we can do our meeting and greeting together in person in the future. Today's policy forum is the first in our series for the year. And the theme this year is Local and Global, What Can We Learn from Each Other? And today we're talking about challenges in education. I'm this year's current MPHA president, and I would like to welcome you all. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope that you will find ways to network with us, whether that's on the chat, whether that is using the MPHA directory to seek us out, or looking us up on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram, where MPHA has different accounts, and just finding ways that we can virtually reach out to each other. I wanted to let you know that the event will be recorded today. So cameras may be on or off at your discretion. Some people have that's at your discretion, but please keep yourself muted. You may use the chat box for questions at any time. And if you need help, please email info@mpha.net or call 612-963-3243. And now at MPHA, we open every meeting with an ancestral land statement, and I will read this statement. We ask that you take a moment to honor and acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe. Indigenous people have a longstanding history and connection to the land since time immemorial, and are the original stewards of lands and waters. Many American Indians were forcibly exiled from their lands because of aggressive and persistent settler colonialism and US governmental policies, but they persevered. We make this acknowledgement to honor the Dakota and Anishinaabe people, ancestors and descendants, as well as the land itself. This is our agenda for today. We are going to have some opening remarks from Tricia Todd, another past president of MPHA. And I just want to give a shout out to Ken Bentz, another past president, and I see others of you also on the call. But Tricia Todd will be opening our session and moderating today. And then we'll hear from each of the panelists. We'll have a Q&A with the moderator, Tricia, and then we'll have some breakout room discussions and time for panelist Q&A around 9 o'clock, 9:05. We'll have concluding remarks, and we will close by 9:30 at 9:25. So, and have time for a couple announcements. We really want to give a warm thank you to Friends of the Forum. The forum's been going on for quite some time, and these Friends of the Forum make an extra special pledge every year to support the forum in all of its different needs. And it really helps us keep the program running. And it's a really nice show of support for the making space to network and to delve into some of the biggest issues of the time in public health. So the names are here, and we encourage you, if you are renewing your membership, to take a moment to consider being a friend of the forum in the coming year. Today's speakers and moderators, they're just a great panel, and I can't wait to hear from them. We have Tricia Todd, who's the Director of Pre-Health Student Resource Center at the University of Minnesota. We will also be hearing from Ellen Solaris, who is the Director of Sexuality Education at the Annex Teen Clinic and the President-elect of MPHA and the co-chair of this year's MPHA conference this spring. We'll hear from Elizabeth Allen, Assistant Professor at St. Catherine University, and Ramona Kitto Stately, Santee Sioux Dakota Nation. She's the Project Director for We Are Still Here, Minnesota. And so I can't wait to hear everything they have to share. And with that, I will hand it over to Tricia to begin our session. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Welcome, everyone. I am very excited to be here today with these wonderful panelists. Having worked in education since 2004, I can honestly say that I've been on a learning curve since the beginning. From public health, which I believe is grounded in education of the public, to working at the U and being involved in education of young adults. Sorry, I have been taught that good education needs listening as a foundation, combined with feedback and respect. My students, both here and abroad, have taught me much seeing and participating in education in Ecuador, India, and Thailand. They've taught me there's no one right way and that we have much we can learn from and with each other. So I know we've already introduced the panelists, but I'm going to give a little deeper introduction to each of them. Ramona Quito Stately is an enrolled member of the Santee Sioux Dakota Nation. She has a BA in Dakota Art and Culture and a Master's of Education with an emphasis on teaching leadership from Augsburg University. After 15 years teaching Indian education in Minnesota, she is now project director for the We Are Still Here Minnesota, creating action for narrative change. Ramona is the mother of 2 children, an accomplished beadwork artist with moccasins on display in the Science Museum of Minnesota, a part of the scholars team of the Minnesota Humanities Center for the Learning from Place, Bedote, and has served as the chairperson of the Minnesota Indian Education Association since 2016. Ellen Solares is the director of sexuality education at the Annex Teen Clinic and president-elect of the Minnesota Public Health Association. She has published peer-reviewed research on adolescent sexuality and has shared her expertise in sexuality education, presenting at national events such as South by Southwest EDU and the National Sexuality Education Conference. She has an MPH in community health promotion from the University of Minnesota School of Public Health and a BA in sociology from Grinnell College. Dr. Elizabeth Allen is an assistant professor at St. Catherine's University in their MPH Global Health program. She holds a master's degree in environmental health and a PhD in environmental epidemiology. In addition, she has completed a postdoctoral fellowship focused on community-engaged research methods to advance health equity and justice. Dr. Allen collaborates with students, international non-governmental organizations, and a global network of scholars in her research. Her work focuses on the impact of environment on the social, emotional, and physical health. Current projects include work on community health volunteer models, women's empowerment in Peru, climate change and domestic violence, and social justice focused on education. Dr. Allen teaches courses in global environmental health, epidemiology, and research methods. With that, I am going to turn this over in the order that I just introduced the speakers to let them have their presentations, and then we can answer questions. Ramona, we'll let you start.
Ami takoyapi, ampetukinde awasi, chante washte anapechu zapie, Ramona Quito Stately and makiapie, damakota. Good morning, my relatives. I wanted to begin my introduction in this with the standard Dakota language introduction, which is the language of Minnesota. And it is the language for 14,000 years. So within that language, there is all kinds of coded information about place and the philosophies and values of the Dakota people who have lived here for thousands of years. So Hami Takuyepi, it means hello, my relatives. And it's a way of greeting, but also remembering that it means hello, my relatives, but it's acknowledging, the earth and the sky and the trees and the universe, the stars, all of us as relatives, which really kind of grounds us in understanding our place in the universe, and the decisions that we make impact all. So I'm really grateful to be here. I am the project director of We Are Still Here in Minnesota. We're a special project of the Native Governance Center, whose mission is to spotlight and make visible the lives and contributions of Native American peoples and their governments in Minnesota today, because we are still here. We will do this by challenging and correcting false narratives, replacing fiction with facts in K-12 education, and finding solutions for issues impacting the Native American community. We will braid together the strengths of established networks in our state of Native American people and organizations focusing on 4 things: governance and policy, K-12 education, pop culture and media, and philanthropy, to uplift our tribal nations, our history, and our citizens. So I want to say Pidama Yaye, and in our language that means you make me grateful. I was very grateful to receive an email from Jean. Thank you for inviting me. And I was really proud to be positioned with a group of professional people who were asking the question, what can we learn from each other? That's awesome. As an educator, I'm afraid of our current K-12 education status in Minnesota. Minnesota ranks 50th in racial disparities for high school graduation rates, meaning that Black, Brown, and Indigenous students continue to fail, and not enough is being done to correct it. This is no anomaly. This is a historic failure, and we continue to toggle between 49th and 50th every year for successfully failing our Black, Brown, Indigenous students. This is a reflection of what has been labeled the Minnesota paradox. Minnesota is one of the best places to live in America. It regularly produces some of the highest average scores in the nation on the SAT exams and boasts a disproportionate share of Rhodes Scholars and admissions to places like MIT and Harvard. The famed Mayo Clinic, and we've seen this, this is your profession, is an international leader in medical research and the development of vaccines for critical diseases such as COVID-19. The housing prices are considerably below normal, below the national median. And this is true only if you are white. Minnesota is one of the worst places to live if you are Black, Brown, and Indigenous. The Reclaiming Native Truth Project, an unprecedented national research campaign, was designed to increase our understanding of the dominant narrative about Native peoples in the United States. In other words, what does America know about Indigenous peoples of this place? The data shows that in the area of education, 23 states do not mention Native American people at all in their entire K-12 curriculum. Of the states that do, they do not teach about Native Americans after 1900. Imagine the message this sends to a developing child in a classroom. There are no more Indians, they don't matter. For the Black, Brown, and Indigenous child, they are deemed invisible. For all children, this sends a very strong message. Being white is important. White children learn early that my teacher looks like me. My identity is consistently reinforced in the lessons that I learn. The heroes I learn about look like me. All the role models look like me. And the books I read reflect people like me. In fact, of all of the children's books published in the United States, only 1% are written by Native American and First Nation authors. So this is all clinched in the 5th grade by the Manifest Destiny. Now, if you think back in your childhood learning, you might have a very visual reminder of what Manifest Destiny looks like. So in my opinion, this is where the gap in the educational system begins, and it's consistently reinforced thereafter. Native Americans are still here today. Despite the history of oppression, we continue to grow and reclaim or remember cultural lifeways and values within distinct cultures. Our narratives and history must be told by us, not interpreted by a colonialist set of people and values. One of the largest perpetrators of reinforcing false narratives occurs in K-12 education system, which becomes the basis of a child's formation of knowing people different from themselves. So this is the formation of a child's understanding of people other than themselves. And that's really important because today in Minnesota, those people are now adults. So that's really powerful. So we're committed to giving teachers the tools to share authentic narratives of the 11 tribal nations in Minnesota and exemplifying our success and resiliency despite great barriers. We've recently seen a great commitment from Governor and Lieutenant Governor to support training and hiring of teachers of color, written authentic curriculum of Native history by Native experts, and the inclusion of ethnic studies. Now that was legislation that was actually failed this year in the legislation, but the governor and the lieutenant governor still provided the funding so we can still move ahead. So that was really a great win. The support of K-12 education reform, inclusion of all history of this state will improve the lives of the next generation by breaking the cycle of ignorance for the people of Minnesota. This support will ensure Minnesotans will have a better understanding of the lived experiences of Minnesota's first and still here inhabitants, and eliminate current disparities of the education system by increasing the knowledge and critical thinking skills of future generations of Minnesotans. So our job as teachers is to create critical thinkers, and you can't exercise reasoning skills, the ability to make really good decisions if you don't have all the information. And that's really precisely what we're doing in our state, is we're teaching to this 100-year-old or 150-year-old white master narrative that hasn't changed. In fact, not much of our education has changed in the last 100 years. So, and especially when it comes to talking about Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. So as Indigenous peoples, we are ancient and we are contemporary. And I think it might surprise you today if I asked you, maybe in a show of hands, to tell me how many of you know that our tribal nations today are the 11th largest employer in the state of Minnesota. So imagine the impact, the financial impact of 11 tribal nations being the 14th largest employer. We're also the second largest tourism draw. So all of this time that we are remained invisible, we have made a lot of progress based on sovereignty. So I'm just curious how many people know that, and then I'll hand it over to the next person. Do we have any hands?
I did not know that.
Did not know that.
Did not know that either. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. I will hand it over to Ellen.
I also did not know that, but I'm going to ask people and get the word out. Good morning, everybody. It's such a joy and honor to be here talking with you all and learning with you all about education and public health. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Sexuality Education at the Annex Teen Clinic. The Annex is located in Robbinsdale, and for the past 50 years, we have been partnering with our community and the schools in Northwest Hennepin County to deliver high-quality sexuality education and clinical services for young people. And so I find myself in the exciting and often challenging intersections of sexuality education, community engagement, and youth work, as well as public health. Over the years, I have partnered with school staff in the implementation of large-scale evidence-based sexuality education programming, as well as supporting staff that run youth leadership councils, do one-to-one education with young people. We also train parents and caregivers to help them feel more comfortable in their roles, talking with young people about growing up and sexuality and relationships and sex. And a lot of my role is also providing technical assistance to school staff and community partners and training as well. The Annex also delivers clinical services in schools as well, which dramatically increases access to confidential sexual health care services. The things that I will be sharing as we answer more of these questions, I think really come from partnership with schools and partnership with young people. I think what underpins most of the gaps we're seeing is disconnection. I think Ramona talked about that disconnection that's happening in the content that's being shared from people's identities and experiences, culture, and their needs. I think schools also often are disconnected from community resources that in collaboration can support a whole person. And applying a positive youth development framework and really working to authentically partner with young people is tremendously impactful. And I think the more that we can build those connections, the better supported young people will be, the more relevant education will be, and the more that the impacts of things that at face value don't seem related to health are related. I will credit Dr. Brady at the School of Public Health for this. She and I were talking about pelvic health a couple of years ago, and we were talking about how when young people don't have access to safe restrooms, or they don't have access to take breaks to go to the bathroom, that impacts pelvic health, bladder health, urinary health for people. And so that adds another layer when we think about the disparities in discipline that happens in schools. Who more often are the young people that are, kicked out of class and have to go sit, in a disciplinary room, or who are the young people that are more likely to not have a request approved to go to the restroom? It's mostly young people of color. And that has obviously social emotional impacts on them. It impacts their learning, and it also is impacting their health. So I've become a real advocate for everyone getting their bathroom breaks and helping people think about all of these layers. I'm looking forward to sharing more with you all, and I will pause here and pass it back to Tricia.
Thank you, Ellen. And now we'll hear from Liz Allen.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I want to actually pivot a little and speak about the year's post-high school graduation. And I love that we're talking about a public health organization is talking about education. It's probably clear to everybody here that people with college degrees have higher earnings, live longer, are more likely to report overall happiness, have overall better health. So this high educational achievement is one of the strongest social determinants of health and a big predictor of overall success. So it's those first couple years post high school graduation that are really critical to an individual's future. Yet we know there are vast inequalities in college admissions in terms of income, race, and ethnicity. So I kind of just want to touch on some of the reasons why these inequalities exist and look at lessons we've learned at COVID that highlight some of those root causes as well. Well, so across the country, all types of universities, we have inequalities with college acceptances, who's actually being admitted, matriculation, who is able to accept their offer, and retention, who stays at the university and graduates. And at each of these junctures, the gap in low-income, non-white first-generation students widens. We have disproportionately fewer of these students that are admitted. Of those, more don't attend, and even fewer reach graduation. So what is happening here? Well, so the first thing is looking at admissions. And one thing we can specifically look at is standardized testing, or SATs and ACTs. It's well documented that students who do well on the SATs have more money and come from higher income families. We know students from the same high schools with the same high level of academic performance score differently solely based on their family income. So students who have the means, they're taking courses, they're getting tutors. We know that money feeds into test scores, yet historically it's considered this objective measure of intelligence, and many universities still base admissions on scores. If you rely on scores, you're probably rejecting excellent students, and they're more likely going to be low income, first generation, and non-white. Something really interesting happened during COVID in that many schools that relied on SAT scores had to move to these test optional policies because of the pandemic. And what happened around the country is that many of those schools saw this uptake in applications among non-white, low-income, and first-generation students. So universities had this more diverse pool of applicants and had to come up with alternative ways of evaluating students. And this has happened before COVID. So a lot of schools have kind of gone to test optional, and when they do that, they see this increase in a more diverse pool of candidates, really showing how those SATs are just not a good measure. So of course, it's not SATs that keep students out of school, it's also money, how much money a university offers. So even when students are admitted, low-income students often end up staying close to home or going to less prestigious schools that offer more financial aid. So colleges can change admissions processes, but they also need to offer aid. So this gets to that like acceptance and matriculation. Even when students are admitted, there are these huge financial barriers that make it unfeasible to attend. And then there's like the graduation rate. Again, those low income, non-white, first generation students are less likely to make it to graduation. So this gets to like campus culture and campus support, inclusive environments when you're on campus to make, success for these students. So then COVID presented new obstacles for first generation low income students. First, low income families were more likely to get sick during COVID, more likely to lose their jobs. High school students needed to work to support the family income. So there was this much greater struggle in putting together the finances needed to go to college for low-income families. And we are seeing that with college admissions. They're low across the country, particularly low among low-income first-generation non-white students. And we also know that delaying college increases the chance of not going at all. So this overall low number of students is unfortunately, they're more likely to never end up going to college at all. And then another barrier we've seen in COVID is at the institutional level, and that universities and colleges are also in this financial crisis and losing money. And they need to take that into consideration when admitting students. Colleges rely on tuition. And so as they're making their decisions, they need to admit students based on who is able to pay. So it's unfortunate that they have to even look at that, but that's what universities are having to do so that they can make it through this financial crisis. So that's kind of post-college. I just want to end quickly with a few solutions, illustrate what we do at St. Kate's a little bit. So I've spoken about undergraduate college admissions, but I teach in the MPH program at St. Kate's, so I'm more familiar with our graduate admissions. But our MPH program is quite diverse in that many of our students are first generation. We have immigrants, non-native English speakers, low income, along with wealthier students with more resources. And so the first thing is like, how do you, attracting a diverse pool of students. And so, how do you do that? For us, we have this structure in that we have evening, online and hybrid classes. So many of our students have full-time jobs. We focus on social justice. So we want to attract students who want to work in a community that focuses on justice. We also look closely at our application review process. A lot of programs might call this a more holistic approach, and that we don't look at GRE scores. We place value on many different experiences. So it's not simply like, do you have experience, work experience, or volunteer experience? We understand that that biases the admission process. It's really more about the person, their lived experience, what brings them to focus on social justice and global health. And then the community here, while we're supporting students after they enter, celebrating what all students have to offer, helps retain and get students to graduation. So I could go on and on, but I'm really looking forward to talking about this more. So thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, I could go on and talk about that as well with you because it is a major challenge, but I'm going to use some of the questions that we originally have, and then we'll take and move in some new directions after that. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, which works with the Department of Education, indicates there are two dimensions of equity in education: fairness, no obstacles to achieving educational potential, and inclusion-based minimum education standards for all. From your perspective, and any one of you can answer this, in whatever order you'd like, but from your perspective and experience, where are the gaps in our educational system? And what are some practical solutions?
I'll go first. So I think Liz said it beautifully. She kind of laid it out there. So first of all, we have Minnesota ranking dead last in successfully graduating Black, Brown, and Indigenous children. And then the impact of having a college education changes your life, right? So our system is built to fail certain groups of people, right? So that's a huge gap. It's a system that is built to that, and it works perfectly because we can see in Minnesota, the graduation rates of white Minnesotans is very high, and Black, Brown, and Indigenous are failing. And I was happy to hear that there's a difference in evaluating applications for college, because I know that that's also one of the critiques has been, and many colleges are still doing this, they are assessing grades. Okay, now if we know we're the worst in the state for graduating a certain group of people, how can grades, and they finally make it through and graduate, how can they be judged by that? That's so it is a system that is built specifically, and we have to think about racism as a system. And people don't like to admit that. So we know that racism oppresses groups, but what we don't really want to talk about is how there's another group that actually benefits. And so that's not assessing people personally, it's assessing a system. And I think that's how we have to look at it. That's how we have to talk about it. And that's how we have to really generate some massive change, because we've changed and grown in this state in the 159 years of statehood. So, yeah.
Ramona, do you have any practical solutions to this?
Yeah, I think that we have to reevaluate a system that doesn't look at, that doesn't reflect society, that doesn't reflect even our values, stabilizing American values. And like we really understand why diversity is important if we're in our garden, don't we? We understand all of those, we call them our relatives, they all have a really essential role in creating a strong garden, a healthy garden, but we don't translate that to our community. So we're ignoring all of those other beautiful, healthy things that create strong and healthy communities and people. So I think we need to include other information. And in Minnesota, it's very interesting. The founder of our Minnesota Historical Society, which is where teachers really look to find accurate history, the founders are people like Alexander Ramsey, who and Henry Sibley, who they're, sixth graders are demanding their schools are names are changed. So I don't know what the power is behind the system that it really, we can't seem to move it and change it. But one of the things is we cannot continue to test, to spend exorbitant amount of money on tests. We have to tell all the information. We have to grow critical thinkers. And we have to really focus on that right now, because what we have today, we have leaders who have been through that system.
Thank you. You're absolutely right on that. Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with what Ramona identified as the gaps. I think it's essential to think about the systems and who are being failed, and also what systems are being reinforced around racism, but I think also around gender and sexual orientation and, you know, ableism. How are all of these systems being reproduced and further empowered to continue onwards? Yeah, the practical solutions that I was thinking about prior to this, a big one I think is community schools. I've worked for a long time with Brooklyn Center, which is a community school, and also the Robbinsdale School District is working to develop more of a community school framework where community partners from a diverse range of organizations with diverse offerings of services for young people are brought in as partners. For the annex, that looks like having educators who are called health mentors that are embedded in a school, and they do a whole range of educational services, including supporting school staff and the community around challenges that come up or questions, you know, supporting young people to advocate for what they need in their schools. We've had young people that were part of the health education curriculum review and advocating for sexuality education to start younger. And that's what needs to happen, is for the people that are impacted by education to have the support and the space to advocate for what they need. I think community schools have so much value. And I think funding to support collaboration is also really important. It takes time to coordinate meetings with all of the community partners. It takes staffing, it takes funding to do that. And I think people deserve to be supported and to be compensated for that work. And there's organizations and partners who I think would love to be more involved in schools, but don't have the capacity or don't have the financial support to hire someone to be in a school. Just going back to what I said earlier about all this disconnection, which also in some ways does not reflect the world outside of educational institutions. So I think that is really important. And increased diversity in hiring, training for people, recognizing that there are standards that need to be achieved and there are those things, but constantly reflecting on whether those things are achieving the goals that we want to achieve and are working towards equity.
Yeah. I want to add here too that, you know, a lot of our public school systems are still funded based on property taxes. So we have this vast difference in quality education based on, you know, neighborhood income, which gets back to like our histories of, you know, redlining and, you know, pockets of communities that don't have these high property taxes. So just at the very basis of funding our schools, these, you know, the system creates these giant inequalities, and that like the per, you know, dollar per student can be, you know, much higher in one public school compared to another. And so that is something that across the board needs to change. And that are like, if like the question about sort of these minimum education standards, that's like impossible if the funding for schools are so vastly different. So that funding structure for public schools has to change entirely. And then I think too, like kind of on a different topic, maybe based on Ramona, your initial comments about, you know, like having educators that look like yourself, or like aspiring to somebody that looks like yourself. So I sort of still think about like the university and the college and like, how are we recruiting people? And getting, you know, we think like, well, let's go to high schools to sort of show, you know, these kind of aspiring careers. But I actually, think it's like younger too, like young people, young elementary and middle school students. It would be great to like kind of partner with colleges and universities and like demonstrate kind of these futures and with people who look like them, not white people going into communities. So it's sort of like this thread, starting young through the university system to then recruit, talented faculty member who are non-white. So yeah, I'll stop there.
So there's a whole lot of questions that could be asked right now, but I want you to, because you all have headed in this direction, we're talking about system barriers. And as a public health professional, we think in systems, but it's one thing to identify those system barriers. We've identified the testing barriers. We've identified the inequity of funding for schools, the need for diversity of educators, and a host of other things, making sure that we have accurate histories. What can public health do to address some of these issues? What do you see our role and responsibility? And what are some of the other biggest system issues that you feel need to be addressed?
Well, I guess right off the bat, I think everybody here understands that education and health are directly related. So one thing you say, what can public health do? It's like education is a priority in health. And I think, public health professionals can at least advocate for that, to demonstrate that this is hugely about quality of life beyond educational attainment, but your whole, your health and well-being is directly tied to education. So putting that as, I guess, on the forefront of like priorities, which I know MPHA does and has. So
I would say the more that we can partner with young people, with school staff, with educators, the better. Thinking about what MPHA could do, I think there are ways to talk more about public health and connect it to what young people know. Young people know that they deserve information. They know that they can make choices that are good for themselves and their health. And they know that they need resources and support to do that. I think being able to provide opportunities for young people to start projects, do participatory action research projects, be on boards, and really authentically support them is something that all of us in public health can do. And I think that's something MPHA can do. How do we get more young people coming into the conference? How do we support them in leadership roles is important. I think the more that we can be involved in the education system and understanding all of those nitty-gritty details of how things work is really beneficial. I've been on the community education advisory councils for Robbinsdale and Brooklyn Center for a few years. And it's not everything that's applicable to sex ed. Very little actually is about sex ed, surprisingly. But learning about how special education is funded, learning about all of these lobbying efforts happening, all of that stuff is really helpful to understand the constraints and pressures on school districts and systems and recognize opportunities to share, my network or my expertise as well.
Ramona, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm sitting here thinking, because I'm not really familiar with the health field, but I love listening to Liz and Ellen. So I think about in our language, and I refer to that because that's like the foundation of who I am, and understanding language for me was key to really managing my own identity, understanding my own identity. And I think that's what what happens to a child. In Dakota, we call them wakaheja, those sacred little ones. They're innocent and they're perfect. And really in K-12, they're looking at teachers because they trust them, they love them. And when they have these experiences of not seeing themselves reflected, I mean, you are, their own identity is not being created, because what they're doing is trying to be as white as they can. So maybe they can get some of that, you know, feeling that they're worthy. And so I don't know the answer. I just know how it impacts this emotional sense of a child who's creating this foundation of knowing who they are. We call it in Dakota wamaji. It means I stand strong in my own power. And that's what happens to white kids in the schools, but not the others, because we actually have to change who we are to be in that system. And that's, you know, that's really awful to think. And when we look at those graduation rates, those are not even the true rates, because those are 9 through 12. Many kids, by the time they're in middle school, they're out, they're gone, because how long can we imagine a child has to take that? So they have to be a different person. But I think the training about sexuality and things like that is really important, but we should also think about rites of passage for our young people. You know, there are a lot of cultural things that are left out. We have beautiful ways of acknowledging the time when a young lady becomes a woman. You know, that's a celebration for the Dakota. It is a celebration where your life changes, where your father acknowledges you differently, where your brothers can't roll around and wrestle with you anymore, where we acknowledge that our own cycles, our menstrual cycles, are exactly the same as the moon, that 28 days. And so we're acknowledging what powerful beings we are. And so without like really looking at all these ways of knowing, just one, we're missing out on this rich and valuable way of raising beautiful, strong wakaheja.
We only have a couple minutes left before we head off into the breakout rooms. One of the things that, as I'm listening to you all talk and being inside the University of Minnesota, working on trying to break down systemic barriers, I find that it's oftentimes put on the people of color to be responsible for making these changes. And I don't think that's right. I think it's the people in power that should be responsible for listening and responding to the needs of the various populations. And there are many different populations, especially in a place like the University of Minnesota. How do you best do that?
I think that we have, as people of color, we have a muscle. It starts when you're very young in those classrooms. The ability to go home and talk about race and talk about how that impacts. I don't think white people ever need to talk about race. They really don't ever. And it's uncomfortable, right? I saw this, I read this book recently, and they were talking, it was a term, white innocence, the act of repelling knowledge. That's very interesting. So we see that if we don't like what we hear, we actually just dismiss it, right? We don't go and try to figure it out. And so, yeah, I just wanted to, I just lost my train of thought, actually. There it is, and try to quicken it. But I just think that the way you can do that is by being an ally. And the only way to be an ally is to be able to have the conversation, learn the vocabulary. That there's a great documentary right now. It's called Stories I Didn't Know, but it really shows the impact of being an ally and how that looks in your own family at the table at Thanksgiving. What if you decided to become an ally, and who would be the people at the table who would not be in on that, right? So it's a risk. So you have to start, and you have to be willing to take that risk, to be courageous.
Yeah, so quickly, I love this question. It comes up a lot amongst my colleagues, and that, across the university, we always say, we want representation on all of our committees. We want to make sure we have this diverse, these diverse committees and lots of voices. But when we have these very few faculty of color, staff of color, then the workload, there's this overburden of work, and those are this burden of work goes on, the people of color and those aren't necessarily recognized, that my non-white faculties are asked to be on committees all the time. And that prevents their own success. It prevents their ability to work on their research and advance their career. So it's interesting, right? That we say we need these voices, but if there's so few, it's not necessarily this person's job to educate white people. And I think about that a lot, because here I am talking about this, inequities in education as a white person, as somebody who has, benefited from the system. But then like you're saying, Ramona, racism won't end unless white people do something to end it. Right. And so then I feel, it's am I the right person to tell this, to speak out, because I haven't had those personal experiences. But then again, yes, white people do need to speak out. And so I have these, it's conflicting of all of these voices need to be heard, but yet we cannot burden our people of color and, to be the ones to educate. So we do need to educate ourselves, and and it's a lifetime of education. So I'm going to be learning for the rest of my life about this. But I just love that question that I grapple with all the time.
All right, Lindsay, do we want to do the breakouts?
Yes, thank you, Tricia. Thank you, panelists. Now we will ask you all to join a small group and come up with a couple of questions for our panelists. So my colleague Mary will be launching breakout rooms. Please accept the invitation to join a breakout room and spend about 10 minutes or so getting to know the people in your room, and please come up with 1 or 2 questions for our panelists. And then when we close the breakout rooms, I will ask you to direct those questions to me in the chat, please. So ask one person to be the note taker and send the question to me in the chat. So Mary, please go ahead and launch the breakout rooms, and we'll see you all back here in about 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, people are heading off to their rooms. Very good. And Mary, I know you are monitoring the breakout rooms, so if some of them have only a couple people, maybe you can do a little shuffling.
Yeah, I think I will do a little bit of shuffling right now.
Do we
Okay,
want to be
great.
recording right now?
So we'll stop the recording, and the recording started. Great, thank you for starting the recording again. Okay, Tricia, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And one more reminder, please forward questions to Lindsay Fabian in the chat, and I will get them to our monitor. All right, back to you, Tricia.
Thank you, Lindsay. Boy, we had a really robust conversation in our breakout room. I hope you guys had some good conversations in yours. But one of the questions that came up that I just wanted to bring back to everyone, because I think it was a great question, is for Ellen and Ramona and Liz. What can we learn from our global citizens elsewhere in the world and how they're addressing education. Are there things that they're doing really well that we could possibly be emulating here? And I know, Liz, you've done some research elsewhere, and Ellen has some experience with this. So Ramona, go ahead, any one of you.
Well, I think,
Oh, you go.
Oh.
You go, Liz.
thanks. As we sort of shared in our breakout room, and I've seen, so as I've done some research in other countries, is that education just seems to be has such a higher value, or early childhood education. And that is apparent in the funding of schools and the pay for teachers. And so it's kind of ridiculous how low what the salary is for teachers when it's like one of the most important parts of our lives is our education. And so that's one thing about at least early childhood education. But then also, we also see in other countries that like post-secondary education is free other places. So immediately that financial barrier goes down, and like opportunities are just more open as in terms of like the financial barriers. But Ellen, you were gonna jump into.
Yeah, I'm glad that you noted early childhood education and how important that is and how the pay is so low. I'm sure many of you have also heard news articles or read articles about childcare and how the folks that are working in early childcare in daycares are paid so little, and they're doing work that is so important for not just infants and kids, but families and communities and society. So I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to note that it sure seems like there are a lot more barriers to in-clinic school-based health centers in the United States compared to other places around the world. And we know from our community partners that it dramatically increases access to healthcare, which is important. And also it's improving educational outcomes because young people are spending less time out of class. We work with some schools that have pretty low attendance. And so they've noted how important it is because young people would go to offsite doctor's appointments and not come back. Other things would come up for them, right? And having all of those services there help. It can decrease, anxiety and things that are on young people's minds if they're worrying, in my field, sitting in class, worrying about a pregnancy, worrying about something in their relationship. Those are important needs that need to be addressed, and doing that in school is helpful. So yeah, school-based health centers are just not given the same value, like Liz was saying, as they are globally.
I think that if we look globally, we see a different importance placed on different types of studies. Except America, in America, do you know that almost all people speak more than one language? And English is probably the worst way of communicating in all languages. But we really, even in our state, we don't value children who have dual language, and how rich and important and different and even in their ways of thinking and working things out by being dual, a multilingual child. So I think we should look at that importance. In fact, when I introduced myself earlier in the Dakota language, that really changed my life. I was 27. My grandparents were fluent speakers. My dad did not speak. Our language was banned. But it was last year, finally, the Minnesota Department of Education gave a language seal to the language of our state, the language that is codified. And so I think that we focus so much on trying to make everyone the same. And what's really important is what makes us unique and different. Like, I don't have the same skills as these other two brilliant speakers today, but the three of us together are able to really create a wonderfully rich conversation. So I think we should try not so hard to make every single thing the same. That's based, community-based learning.
So I'm getting a lot of different questions here. This one's going to be a pretty tough one to answer. So if you don't want to try, what are ways to address funding differences between districts, especially when parents with special needs may move into the district with more programs, though there are many unfunded mandates?
Well, they went for it, right? That question. It's such, I can see this challenge in answering because it's such a huge policy question, and I think that's where I think that's where it is policy change in where funding comes from and putting funding into our education program. So it's like we need economists and policymakers on these same interprofessional forums to help, because none of us can answer these questions alone. So I don't have a good answer other than vast policy change.
And Liz, I think I really appreciate that perspective, because I think too often we sit in our silos and have conversations when we could problem solve better if we had much greater diversity of thought in the room. Mm-hmm. There's another question here. Are there places in the US where education is being done better? And can we learn from that? I know there's places that it's equally as bad as it is here. So anybody have any thoughts on that?
I don't want to overspeak. I do know of one example from a university perspective. So if we're interested in looking at the university, I'll just quickly share. Interestingly, it's in Texas, like the University of Texas, UT Austin has this program where they admit the top 10% of every high school student in the state. So what that means is that students from all different high schools, wealthy suburban high schools, rural, Latino majority high schools with huge turnover, no matter where you go in the state of Texas, you go to this very, well-known high quality school, UT Austin. And so their freshman class is extremely diverse. And so I think a lot of critics would say, does that set students up for failure? You come from this, your baseline is very different, but they've found that most universities who do this tend to put students into remedial classes. And when they do that, those students never catch up. They stay in a remedial class and kind of fail. So they've taken this totally different approach. Everyone starts together. And yes, the students who come from lower quality high schools struggle and get lower grades to begin with. And they have some emotional struggles of feeling, imposter syndrome, these psychological barriers. So a lot of that they see, but they've instead said, we're not going to change the quality of the education. They still have to complete freshman calculus, but they offer tons of social support. A lot of it is just motivational, you can do this, you deserved your spot here. They're teaching students how to learn. A lot of the students arrive with they never needed to learn how to learn, because they just kind of did it. They weren't challenged in high school. So they really focus on that small groups, kind of one-on-one mentoring. And they have found that after the first semester or two, that the playing field is more even. And that in those later years, when they get to the more challenging classes, everyone struggles, and it doesn't have that disproportional, depending on what high school you came from. And so they have shown high success rates of graduation. And I think that gets to, there was a comment earlier about admitting students, but then if they end up failing out, that's not justice, right? I don't think it's justice either to pass a student along. We see that with some, earlier education, when students make it to high school and cannot read, that's not justice. Passing somebody through the school system that don't meet competencies. And so that's why I really like this UT model. They're not passing students along. They're saying, no, you need to do well in calculus, and it's not an easier class. But you see students rise to the occasion. When they're challenged, they do it. And so this notion that if you don't have the background, or you're incapable of doing this, is just wrong, I think. And so I'd say that is at least an example of a university doing things a little differently.
So I'm going to follow up with that one. Is the only option to go to a four-year university or college? But what are the other options? And are
Yeah, I think that's another narrative that needs to be addressed, that what success looks like, or what the goal is, or what, is going to work best for everyone is the same. There certainly are non-four-year options. There are trade programs and certifications that are very fulfilling and are worthwhile for people to do. I think we're seeing people through this narrow path and not taking into consideration what they need or what's going to work best for them doesn't serve anyone well, and it's not best for us. And I think the more that we can value those programs and the folks in the careers doing those programs, the better off we're all going to be.
So I know there are pockets around the country here that are absolutely challenging critical race theory. And there's a question here that says, are there national efforts to consolidate, coordinate changes in the educational system to incorporate the true history of our country?
Yeah, I think that critical race theory is a weaponized use of language to spread this hate about learning. I call it history. It's just not included the true history of our state. And why are we so willing to just dismiss other people's histories? How is that okay? In our state of Minnesota, I'll give an example of that, is 159 years of people making decisions about Minnesota and place without having a relationship to it, without knowing its history. Clear cut all the white pine in the state, so we know that T.B. Walker made billions of dollars on the lumber in our state. And still, we still see those families living on that privilege. They've made the decisions in 159 years that have polluted all of the rivers and lakes in our state. So we really have to be able to focus on what's important locally. Who are the leaders that are making those decisions? And it's not critical race theory. That's a weaponized use of language to stop us from telling the truth. And we need to know the truth. And we know that the history of land is important. If we're buying land, oh my goodness, what is there? There's a whole history of the land that we purchase, an abstract, right? But when we're talking about the history of Minnesota 159 years ago, we're not going to talk about that. It's important to know, and it's important to know so we can critically think and use information to not make the same decisions, because in our language, Mani, which is the beginning of our state name, the N-I part, Ni, it means our life force, our very life force. So I really wonder what the impact is of just really bad decision making. And we're not creating critical thinkers because we're teaching to a test. So I think it's really important to think of the impact of and why it is so important to have these conversations. So thank you. And to look at ways that we can support positive change.
All right. So I have another question here that says where to seek funds for adequately compensating people for their time, thinking about people serving on committees for surveys, studies, consulting, etc. Any thoughts on that?
I'm not clear on the question.
I think the
Yeah, could you repeat it
question.
again, please?
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, could you repeat it again?
Yeah, that somebody's asking where to seek funds for compensating people for their time. I think this is going back to Liz's comments about how we ask people to be serving on, people from the diverse communities to serve on a gazillion committees when they don't have, I mean, that just takes them away from their work. And they don't get compensated for it. There's no reward for doing that. So I think that's what the question is. And please, if that's not correct, feel free to put the question in the chat.
I don't know places that fund that, except I think that if you're an organization with committees and you're have a commitment to a certain committee, you need to find the funding. I don't know of a place where you could actually go, but I also know that, you know, as a Native person, I am asked to be on like boards, and you know, those rules are you have to give. It's like, oh my God, okay, that can't happen. And so there are barriers even when you're invited to be on a board. And so that's challenging as well.
I mean, I guess I can share like if you're looking at like a specific institution, like, so for us, our job is teaching, research, and service. But it's very broad. So we need, you know, to contribute service to our university and to the profession. Yet some of my BIPOC colleagues are asked to be on, you know, 20 committees, and I'm, you know, maybe on one. So I think, you know, at a university level, or at like a sort of in a smaller level, you can place more value on that service and say, we're going to give you time, reduce teaching load if we expect this increase in service. Or, you know, we're trying to push for like placing value on being like the BIPOC faculty member. It's these like unwritten and like undocumented service where my faculty of color gets all of the like questions about race from the students. So much like emotional support. And that's not documented. How many times students show up into her office, or, you know, into their offices, and that again takes away from their work. So I think like from the top, you can place value on that and say, because you serve so much in this capacity, we need to reduce your load in this capacity. And I think, you know, so individual sort of organizations need to sort of acknowledge and recognize the importance of that and pay for it in a way with time or, you know, money.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is a super helpful resource, but I know that Headwaters Foundation for Justice has some grant opportunities that come up around collective work for liberation and justice. I'll put the link to their website in here. As a nonprofit person, that's where almost all of the education work is funded through grants. And I know that's not as accessible or how other folks fund their work. But we have seen increasingly more funding opportunities, albeit not ginormous, to support projects around internal work as well as external work in accessibility and justice and inclusion and diversity. But it takes some work to find them.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Ramona. Thank you, Liz. This has been a very robust and broad conversation. And I think sometimes when people are part of these big conversations, they feel a little paralyzed. And so I would just encourage everyone to think about, what can you do in your circle of influence, and do something, because I think that's where we can make change. We can't What happens too often is we say, well, I'll leave it for someone else because this is too big. No, think about your own circle of influence and do whatever you can in that circle of influence. I will hand it over to Mary Graham now. Thank you.
Thank you, Trisha. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Ramona, for a wonderful and thoughtful policy forum this morning. I am just so pleased that we were able to have this conversation, and I'm really grateful to everyone who was able to join us this morning. So thank you all for attending. Like any good public health event, we always are looking for ways to understand how we can do better and improve, and what you liked and didn't like. So please feel free to give us your thoughts in the feedback form that's posted in the chat. We have a number of upcoming events. The policy forum events are listed here on the slide. So our next breakfast morning policy forum will be on January 14th, where we will be talking about challenges in maternal and child health. And then 2 more forums following in March and May. I will also put a link to, if you want to continue some conversations, and maybe you will think about what you can do, in your own circle of influence over the weekend. Feel free to come back on Monday and join us for a half-hour coffee chat. The link is in the chat. You can also visit our website at mpha.net to learn about our other upcoming events, how you can get engaged, some of the resources that we share with our community, and of course, how you can join and become a member if you're not already one. We have a great membership and communications committee that keeps our social media platforms up and interesting. So if you're not following us, please look for us at MN Public Health. And I think that is it. So thank you, everyone. It's been a wonderful morning with you. We'll keep this Zoom open for just a minute so people can say goodbye to each other, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, panelists.